Hey guys, so today's video is going to be another info dump. So I recently realised that something that I also like a lot and can talk a lot about is 80s movies and 90s movies. Specifically, I really enjoy romance films. So it kind of falls into two main genres that I've noticed. One is sort of teen romance films like John Hughes and that kind of thing, which I've watched quite a few of those. And then also I've started watching a few more like adult ones, like a few of the classics. And that leads me into today's video where I thought I would combine three of them, which I am calling the unofficial Michael Douglas problematic erotic thriller trilogy. So I'm going to talk about three films today. The first one is Fatal Attraction, which came out in 1987. The second one is Basic Instinct, which came out in 1992. And the third one is Disclosure, which came out in 1994. So the reason that I've grouped these three films together is because not only are they all erotic thriller films, kind of in that loose genre, but I feel like they're all doing very similar things with the kind of gender politics, sexual politics, just like the way that they sort of treat women, the relationship between men and women, and like the power dynamics. And I feel like they all end up telling kind of the same story in a different way. So it just seemed logical to kind of not info dump about them separately, but to talk about them as like a little unofficial trilogy, especially because Michael Douglas is in all three, so he kind of ties them together in a weird way, even though I think they're all different directors. I can't remember the exact director for each film. So the first film I'm going to talk about is Fatal Attraction, which came out in 1987. This film obviously stars Michael Douglas, and Glenn Close is the romantic interest who plays opposite him. This was also remade in, I think, 2022 or 2023, which I have seen, with Joshua Jackson and Lizzie Kaplan playing the two characters. I watched all of that version, but I thought it was terrible. I actually thought that the film was in a way more progressive than the new one, which is saying something, because when I explain all this film you'll understand that it's not a very progressive film. But yeah, I think that this one I have the least to say about of the three, so I guess I can kind of, you know, it's handy that it's the first one chronologically and I can kind of get it out of the way. But yeah, so Fatal Attraction is about a family man called Dan Gallagher, played by Michael Douglas, and he's a very happy family man. He loves his wife. They have a child together called Ellen, and Dan Gallagher works in like a legal firm. I don't know if he's actually a lawyer or if he just works in like the legal department. I think he's actually a lawyer. And yeah, he's you know, trucking along, living a happy life, when he meets a woman played by Glenn Close. And this woman is called Alex Forrest. And Alex Forrest is like I think she's an editor. She works in like publishing, basically, which, you know, it seems like a bit of a weird way of their paths crossing, but you find out after they've met that the reason that they well, they meet first at a party and then they meet again through his work, because he's looking at some legal issues with a novel, like where they're like, we need to figure out whether or not this author is likely to get sued for the way they've presented a character. So that kind of brings Dan and Alex back together. But they initially meet at a party and, you know, nothing happens, but there's like this attraction between them. One of Dan's colleagues has actually hit on Alex, and like she just gives him this death stare. And later when Dan walks over to the bar, you know, he's like, oh, I'm really glad that wasn't me. And she's like, oh, was it that bad? And he's like, yeah, you know, but she's just like, I hate it when guys think that they can like crack onto you like that. So they have this initial meeting and nothing happens. But then they meet again through his work. And yeah, it turns out conveniently that his wife is away with their child for the weekend at like their grandparents' house or something. So he's had this meeting with Alex, and then they have this sort of very cheesy like chance encounter. at the end of the workday where it's pouring with rain outside, and he's kind of like fumbling with this broken umbrella. So like she comes over to like, you know, let him share her umbrella, and they're like, oh, you know, why don't we just get a drink out of the rain until this like storm has passed. So they go get a drink and they're flirting, and you know, it's sort of a little bit ambiguous at first whether anything's actually going to happen. You know, she's saying like, oh, you know, you're being a naughty boy having this drink with me while your wife's away. And you know, at first it seems like she's not even really sure if she's interested, which I think is a very interesting way to play it, because as I'll get into, her like intentions really change throughout this film and become very different. But at first it seems like she's not like super into him, but they do hook up, and they start this kind of like, you know, affair over the weekend. Like they go back to her place and have sex, and they go out dancing, and then they go back to her place again. And then the next morning it seems like Dan kind of just wants to, you know, go home and go back to his life, and Alex like doesn't want to let that happen, and she gets really upset. And she ends up like, I think this is while he's out of the room, but she ends up like cutting her own wrists, and you know, he has to stay with her and look after her. But then like even after he's done that and like sort of done the right thing, and you know, stayed around to make sure she's okay, you know, he still wants her out of his life now. It's like, you know, he's had this like little like naughty affair that he shouldn't have had, and he just wants everything to kind of go back to normal. But Alex like doesn't accept that at all. And she starts calling him and hassling him. She wants him to go see Madame Butterfly with her, and he's not interested. And you know, this attention from her just escalates over the course of the film, and you know, she's very much like, you know, you can't just ditch me, you can't just dump me. And she becomes very obsessed with him, and yeah, it just kind of continues to escalate. She puts like a bomb, or I think she throws acid on his car. Actually, she does something to his car, throws acid on it, and like just continues to like ramp up this like dangerous level. And Dan is doing everything he can to try and get away from her, and he doesn't want his wife to find out, but obviously she does eventually find out. And the big kind of famous scene of the film, which unfortunately I did know about this scene before I watched the film, so it definitely, even though it's very cleverly done, like the impact of the scene was lost a little bit for me because I'd already heard about this. But the family have a pet bunny rabbit, and you know, the mother is like asking her daughter to like go feed it or something, and they just can't find this rabbit. And she has been like cooking on the stove, and you know, she goes off to look for this rabbit. She comes back, and there's this big boiling, bubbling pot on the stove, and she lifts up the lid. I forgot the word lid. She lifts up the lid, and what should be inside but the rabbit is boiling on the stove. So this is where the expression bunny boiler has come from. I don't know if anyone has ever heard this. I don't really think it gets used very much anymore. I mean, I guess partly because it's a really sketchy, you know, because of this film is very not great anyway, like with this depiction of Alex, which I'll get into in a sec. But the term bunny boiler just kind of means this like unstable, dangerous woman, and that's what Alex has become. And her mental health obviously plays a really big part in this. And in fact, when I was reading more about this film, apparently Glenn Close was really reluctant to, like she wasn't keen on the whole bunny boiling thing. And in fact, it is the reason why a lot of other actresses turned down the role. But Glenn Close did consult with a lot of sort of psychologists and stuff for the film, because she really wanted to portray Alex as like a more three-dimensional woman. Like, you know, she's not just this crazed woman who kind of can't handle, you know, the fact that this man doesn't want to be with her, and that she's gonna do all these dangerous things and cause all these problems. She really wanted to kind of depict her in a more kind of compassionate way, you know, like she's broken, and she's like, the fact that the film is still very problematic, that she does a really great job at doing that. But yeah, it feels like the antithesis to, you know, there's kind of two sides to this film. One is that, but yeah, it feels like this film is contradicting itself a little bit, because it's kind of giving two different messages about Alex. One is that she's meant to be this independent, sexually liberated woman, and she can be with whoever she wants. She's not tied down to this kind of like monogamy and domesticity that Dan Gallagher is with his like family man commitment to his wife and child. But then you also have this other side to her where you know, her like going after Dan so obsessively and wanting him for herself, it feels very I don't know what the word is, retro something. It feels very backwards that you know, they've presented her as being that way, only to then reaffirm this idea that actually all these women really do just want to be tied down, and they do just want this one man, and that, you know, the moment that she has this sleeps with Dan, that she needs to be with him and she needs to like take him for herself, and she needs that same level of like commitment and security and love, and you know, this idea that you know, it kind of, it's giving this idea that ultimately she still is just using sex to try and trap him into commitment, which feels really like opposed to, you know, her being this non-committed person who, and even in their first encounter when they go to this coffee shop together, when they get caught in the rain and they go for a drink, and you know, he says like, oh, shouldn't you, it's Friday night, shouldn't you have a date? And she's like, oh yeah, I did, I just cancelled it, you know, to talk to you. And you know, it's like he knows that she can be with anyone she wants, but it feels like the moment that she sleeps with him, she suddenly loses all this power that she supposedly has, and kind of becomes this stereotype of like not only a woman who like desperately wants this like commitment, and like, you know, that she's not free of all of that desire, that like it was secretly there all along, and like she was just biding her time with all these like casual relationships. But then also that they then turn her into this like crazed mental illness you know, like the mentally ill crazed woman who's like unhinged and like, you know, out to like trap the man and kind of pin him down into like commitment, and you know, like it's a trick, it's a trap, and she's like used her sexuality and her feminine wiles, and it's like the minute he sleeps with her, it's like she's got him where she wants him. And I think that all three of these films do that quite a lot, and this is one of the kind of like running themes throughout that is like, you know, just feels really outdated and kind of frustrating. And I think that Fatal Attraction really speaks to kind of multiple, like all of these films speak to anxieties about women having power, which is something that I'm going to come back to with Basic Instinct and Disclosure. But for Fatal Attraction, there's this anxiety that like what does a, you know, an independent sort of sexually liberated woman represent, and you know, these fears. And I think it comes into a little bit as well because Alex is implied to be a bit of a career woman as well, so that becomes more of a theme, I think, in Disclosure. But again, there's all these different layers of women having power that like is making men and like society in a broader sense uncomfortable, and that they need to be put back in their place. And this is also a theme throughout all three films where you know, it's like this woman has too much power and then something has to be done to sort of reassert the status quo. So in Alex's case, I think that you know, because she has this alleged power as this like liberated woman, that they have to then balance that out by making her mentally ill and making her unhinged, because otherwise you would have had this very different film where, you know, she could have been the one who just gone out and used Dan, or maybe even not used him at all, maybe like, you know, him having the knowledge that he could never have her. They could have, you know, gone different ways with that, and then she would have actually been the one with power. But in this case, the power is very quickly taken away from her, and both in her being mentally ill, and also in the fact that she becomes very emotionally into Dan. In fact, this is also a thing throughout all three films where like all these women are just like, the minute they've had a taste of Michael Douglas, they're just like obsessed with him, and it's like he always has the power, and it's kind of frustrating to watch, to be honest. But yeah, so Alex really represents this threat that women pose to society who aren't looking to settle down and have a family and have children, which I think, you know, especially with the 80s being this kind of capitalist boom and like second, I think it would have been around second wave feminism around that time, just after, maybe, I think that was in the 70s. But like this idea that women could be powerful now, they could be the queer women, and they have, you know, they have the pill and they don't need to settle down and have relationships, they don't need to settle down, I'm sorry, get married and have children. They can just have these relationships of their own free will, of their own autonomy in their own way, and they're not like beholden to men and dependent on them. And this film, I think that one of the interesting things that I read was that Alex also represents not just the idea that that kind of woman needs to be eliminated because she poses a threat, but she also symbolized, and this is also something that will come up in Basic Instinct, which I'm going to come back to, but she also symbolizes sexual promiscuity itself. And obviously the 80s was the peak of the AIDS crisis, and Alex came to represent this idea of like a foreign dangerous disease or agent that could kind of come into these like nuclear family homes and kind of pose a threat. So it's both her sexuality and, you know, the kind of the sort of sexual promiscuity that comes with that, and both of those things, how they could infect and destroy this sacred nuclear family that has to be upheld at all costs. So the film really takes a very literal approach to that at the end, with Alex literally coming into the home, and she's already threatened them with the bunny rabbit, but at the very end she comes into the home and she tries to kill Dan's wife, whose name I can't remember. She tries to kill Dan's wife, and, you know, I don't know whether it's the idea that she's going to take the place of Dan's wife, but, you know, the idea that this sort of sexually promiscuous, freewheeling, liberated woman can't take the place of the wife, like, that's the threat. And also that this AIDS metaphor. So Dan ends up killing her, you know, like, she tries to kill the wife, he manages to kill her, and, you know, that's her eliminated finally, and they can, you know, they have a sort of happy ending of sorts, where now the status quo and the balance and the safety and security of the family has been restored. So now Dan can kind of go back to his wife, who, you know, he's broken her trust forever, but, like, you know, in theory it's like they can kind of carry on now and everything's back to normal and the balance has been restored. And interestingly, apparently they did have an alternate ending originally planned, where Alex was going to kill herself. I'm not sure why they decided not to go with that. I think that I don't know, I suppose maybe it wouldn't have had the same impact in some ways. But yeah, that is basic instinct. It's not Basic Instinct, it's Fatal Attraction. That is Fatal Attraction, and yeah, I think the reason I find all of these films really interesting is what they're trying to say. And even though now it's like it's so far removed from, well, I say it's far removed, I think that actually the idea of like liberated women, you know, having these relationships on their own terms is still actually very threatening in a lot of ways. And we think that we've moved on, but I don't think we have moved on as much as we think we have. So even though Fatal Attraction now is this very far-fetched kind of representation of that feeling, I think that those anxieties are still there. And I think it's one of the reasons why I find these films really interesting, because like these themes, even though they're so problematic now, they make for such interesting talking points. Like, I feel like I have so much to say about these films and like what they're trying to do and what hasn't worked, what feels very dated. And it's quite sad actually that, you know, this running theme throughout these three films is like, you could really get the sense of how much more power women had and how threatening that was to the status quo, and how like these films kind of, I don't know, it was like a way of society kind of, in my opinion anyway, like kind of medicating itself. Like, we need to soothe ourselves through this process of women gaining so much more power. So we're going to create these really far-fetched scenarios where we can kind of make them the villains, or we can kind of show the ways that their sexuality feels like it could be weaponized against us, and how threatened we feel by that. And we really need to, we really need to kind of dismantle their power, even if it's just in this symbolic way. So, but yeah, that's Fatal Attraction. Okay, so the second film I'm going to talk about is actually my favourite of the three. And I think that's just because I feel like it's kind of doing the most interesting things, and I actually think, unlike the other two films, it kind of is progressive in some ways, or at least it felt like it was trying to be. But maybe that is just because of Sharon Stone's depiction, which I'll get into. So Basic Instinct came out in 1992. Again, it's Michael Douglas as the lead. This time he plays a detective called Nick Curran, and his female co-star is Sharon Stone, who plays Catherine Trammell. So the plot of this film is that Nick Curran is brought in to investigate the death of a rock star called Johnny Boz. And Johnny Boz has been killed during sex with an ice pick very violently by what they believe could be his girlfriend, Catherine Trammell. So Nick goes to talk to Catherine Trammell. He needs to keep her around because she's now suspect, and kind of like, start tailing her, start finding out what's going on with her. While he's doing this, he finds out that Catherine Trammell is an author, and her most recent book that came out before this murder happened was about a woman who killed a rock star using an ice pick. So obviously that makes her look even more guilty, but as she argues herself, she's like, why would I write a book about this and then do it, like, that's a really dumb thing to do. But then they're like, maybe you did that so you have an alibi, because it seems really weird that somebody would incriminate themselves in that way. So like, maybe it's sort of a bit of a double bluff of like, oh, it's so obvious that I could have done it, like there's no way I therefore could have done it, but actually she did do it, if that makes sense. So yeah, Nick starts tailing Catherine Trammell, learning more about her. He also finds out that she has a girlfriend called Roxy, so she is bisexual, although the film never actually uses the word bisexual, unfortunately. And yeah, she reveals to Nick that her next book that she's writing is going to be about a detective who falls for the wrong woman, which is obviously, great foreshadowing to the fact that Nick does, start to fall for her himself. So while Nick is investigating Catherine, we also get a little bit more backstory about him. So we find out that Nick is trying to pass a sort of psychotherapy exam type thing to prove that he's fit, like fully fit for duty again. And the reason for this is because a little while back he shot some people during an altercation. I think he was trying to arrest some people, but it all kind of went wrong. He shot some tourists by mistake, and he's been given the nickname Shooter by one of his colleagues who, just doesn't want to let him forget, basically. So Nick is sort of seeing this sort of psychotherapy. So the psychologist that Nick is seeing is called Beth, and she's a really stereotypically beautiful woman as well. And you find out that her and Nick are also sort of having this on-off thing. Again, in a similar way to Fatal Attraction and also what Disclosure does later, you have kind of yet another woman who, could be very kind of sort of sexually empowered and independent and so on, but she's like immediately reduced to being kind of infatuated with Michael Douglas, which is really annoying. Like, they have this whole scene where she's asking Nick all these kind of obligatory questions that she needs to ask him about, like his personal life, whether or not he's taking any cocaine, whether or not he's drinking alcohol, because she needs to know all this stuff to figure out if he's kind of getting back on track to stability, and whether or not he can kind of be given his gun back. I kind of assume they've taken his gun away from him. And you know, so this whole scene, like, she's asking him all these humiliating questions for him, you know, putting her in the position of power. But then at the very end of the scene, when he's about to leave, she's like, "I miss you." So like, it's obvious that they've been having this affair. You know, and just giving Nick kind of this power back, which kind of frustrated me, as so many of these scenes do in these films. And yeah, so Nick has you know, his buddies are all kind of like, oh, you know, sleeping with the psychologist, it's not a great idea. But yeah, Nick and his psychologist have this like obviously very problematic relationship where they're kind of sleeping together on and off. But you know, she's trying to help him get back on the right track. We also have a really unpleasant scene in the film where he rapes her. There's been like a moment in the bar that they're all in where one of their colleagues, you know, is calling Nick shooter, and he's trying to antagonize him, and Nick is kind of squaring up for a fight, and Beth shows up and kind of like, you know, pulls him out of it, and they go back to her place, and they start to have sex, but then it becomes really violent, and you can tell that, you know, I don't know whether or not Nick is angry about, you know, what's happened with this colleague who was antagonizing him, or whether he's thinking about Catherine Trammell and how much he wants to sleep with her. But it starts to become quite violent and non-consensual, and yeah, it's not entirely brushed off, but obviously it's not really treated with the gravitas that it deserves. Like, they're kind of lying together afterwards, and she says like, oh, you've never been like that before, and you know, but she still continues to kind of care about him and look out for him, and you know, they're kind of at odds at points, but like, it's obvious that they both care about each other. And it's sort of, yeah, just frustrating that, you know, after he rapes her basically, that she still is looking out for him, and kind of, it's not really, I don't know, it's almost like a kind of like, it's sort of inevitable that women should be treated this way. And you know, you have other moments in this film, and in all the films actually, where Michael Douglas is like shouting at women or kind of intimidating them in various ways. And I think it can be easy when you kind of get used to sort of the cultural language of these films and kind of forget, or maybe not forget, but like it becomes a little bit, or it's certainly treated in the films with less power, less intention than I think it would be if you saw it in a film now. Like, I think it would be read, well, I mean, it is read very differently, but I think that it's a lot more normalised, and I think that it's sort of written off as like, this is how men are supposed to be, like, they're supposed to be powerful, they're supposed to, you know, shout and get angry and be threatened, and women are supposed to bear the brunt of that. So that just feels like a really unfortunate example of it, which is a shame. But yeah, so Nick continues to try and figure out Catherine Trammell. There is a very famous, well, the most famous scene in Basic Instinct that, you know, I need to talk about, where Catherine Trammell is taken to the police department to be questioned, obviously, about her relationship with Johnny Boz, you know, while they're trying to work out if she could be a suspect or not. And she sits in this chair, and she's kind of like got all these men in sort of like a semicircle around her, like they're kind of here. She's in the light on a chair. Yeah, so they're questioning Catherine Trammell. There are two, before I get into the famous Basic Instinct scene, which a few people will obviously already know about, but there are two scenes in this film where Michael Douglas watches Catherine Trammell like either getting changed or like taking off her clothes without her knowing. And this is like a really common trope in I don't know, like thrillers, sometimes in romances, it depends on the genre really, but I think it's quite a common trope to have a scene where a man gets to watch a woman in some kind of state of undress and she doesn't know about it. And you know, it's very icky, it's very voyeuristic, obviously it's very non-consensual. I will say that, like, in the context of the rest of this film, I actually think that even though there's meant to be the power dynamic when Michael Douglas is in control. It actually doesn't feel that way in this film, like, because he's the one who's very enamored with her, and she's kind of leading him on this wild goose chase. You know, it almost feels like, in the language of the film, that there's meant to be a sense of ambiguity as to whether or not she maybe knows that he's watching or doesn't care. Like, you know, in both of the scenes, like, it's not like she's kind of she's not like drawn any curtains or done anything to kind of prevent her from being watched, which isn't to say that she's consenting to being watched, but I think that there's sort of an implication that you could read that she's inviting that being watched, or she doesn't care, which is sort of meant to be part of her, you know, mystique and so on. Although, you know, at the end of the day, it still feeds into this sort of sexualization of her character, and arguably like an objectification as well, which again is kind of quite a present theme throughout the movies, but especially Disclosure, which I'll get onto. So yeah, anyway, she and the reason that I mentioned this as well is because in one of the first scene where you see him watching her without knowing, she's completely nude before she puts on this white dress, which then leads into the next scene wherein she's being interrogated, and the famous moment is that she's, you know, she's got her legs crossed, but she uncrosses them, and they kind of do like an up the dress shot, so you can kind of see some of her vulva and like some of her kind of nether regions, before she kind of recrosses her legs. And interestingly, what I had read about this scene was that Sharon Stone claims that she didn't know they were going to do that, which, if that's true, is like, you know, very, very gross and very upsetting. Apparently she was originally wearing white underwear in the scene, and, you know, she did the like cross leg, uncross leg thing, and the director said, oh, you know, the light is reflecting off the white underwear and it doesn't look good. Can you look, if you take them off and we refilm it, like, we'll make sure that like nobody sees anything, and it'll kind of just be like, you know, a little bit of shadow, and it'll sort of be implied that she's not got any underwear on or something. And then obviously when, you know, they did do it, they didn't actually do that at all, and you can see, you know, you can see everything. So Sharon Stone was really upset about that. According to the Wikipedia, she later came around and was like, oh, you know, I do understand why they did it, but I just wish they would have, you know, asked me first, which, you know, is like more than fair. Like, I think it's really underhanded and kind of skeevy, sleazy of them to do it that way and not like get her permission at the end of the day. And, you know, it kind of almost in a way reflects a lot of the vibe of these, you know, the actual films themselves, like art imitates life, or life imitates art in this case. But yeah, that's a little bit of trivia for you on the scene, on the famous scene. So obviously Catherine Trammell is bisexual, basically, even though they never use the word. She sleeps with men, and she also has her lover Roxy, who she tells Michael Douglas when she starts to sleep with him that Roxy likes to watch her with other men. So Roxy doesn't really get jealous, she enjoys it. But then apparently, you know, because Michael Douglas comes along, apparently because he's so great in bed and he's got some kind of like incredible dick or something, she does get really jealous of Michael Douglas. Yeah, they have this weird, like, Michael Douglas isn't threatened by her, but he is homophobic towards her. One of the things I do find really interesting about this film is that it's sort of like not really what you would expect, in a lot of ways. So like Michael Douglas, like, he's never shown as like, not only is he never shown as sort of like getting off on the fact that that Catherine enjoys being with women. Like, there's a scene where you know, she's kind of like kissing Roxy in front of him and he's like completely like unbothered about it. And then like they have a later scene at the club where she's just starting to get with Michael Douglas and she's dancing with Michael in front of Roxy, and Roxy looks quite like pissed off and jealous and like very like threatened. You kind of like, if you imagine a cat that's kind of like, you know, on its horn, you know, when they're like ready to pounce, like that's kind of the energy that Roxy is giving off when she's watching this happen. So she's very bothered about it. But yeah, I thought, I'm not necessarily going to give it credit because, as I'll get into, like, there's some other stuff, but I do think it's interesting that Michael Douglas, like, not only is he not, you know, it's not like it's there to titillate him, that this woman like is into another woman. But I also think it's genuinely interesting that like he doesn't really make any kind of commentary on Catherine's sexuality at all. Like he doesn't seem to care. Like he doesn't treat it any differently than her being with the other men. The only other thing I will say is that he does make a homophobic comment, which I hate, where after he slept with Catherine for the first time, he like, you know, he walks naked into this bathroom, and Roxy's there. I think she's coming from like another room or something, because the house is laid out really weirdly, but like she's there in like a leather jacket or whatever, and he says like, oh, you know, let's talk man to man, and I'm like, oh, that's like really, you know, like he's putting her in this position of like this jealous male lover, and like she's the man of the relationship, which is quite, you know, outdated and lame. But like other than that, there's not really anything that like, you know, he's not really particularly bothered about it, which I thought was quite nice, I guess, for like the time period. But yeah, Roxy unfortunately meets her demise. She basically tries to kill, everyone tries to kill each other in these films, so she tries to kill Michael Douglas in like a fit of jealous rage in her car, and he kind of manages to, you know, swerve, and she kind of careens off some kind of, you know, little into like a quarry or something and dies. So, you know, unfortunately, I guess we do get the kind of like bury your gays thing, which isn't too surprising, but yeah, other than that, I don't know if I'm gonna say I give it kudos, but I will say that it wasn't being actively disgusting in respect of you know, Catherine's sexuality. Obviously with Catherine fairly unambiguously being the killer throughout this film, you know, a lot of people were pissed off. You know, it's like you know, you've got this bisexual woman and you've made her like a killer. I think for me that doesn't bother me now, but that's because I have the benefit of having grown up in a time period where there is a lot more bisexual representation. So I can imagine if somebody went to see Basic Instinct in 1992, when there was like, you know, barely any representation of bisexual women, that, you know, I can see why they would be pissed off, like, oh, I finally got this, you know, bisexual character and she's like she's a serial killer. So, you know, I can see why. I'm gonna say that that's, you know, for me, I can fully understand why people were angry about that. So yeah. But yeah, so this film, again, like, there's a common theme throughout all these three. It's playing with the ideas of you know, sexually liberated women being threatening again, and you know, again, it's taken to a very literal conclusion with Catherine being an actual killer. And you know, like the film even opens with this scene that really reflects these anxieties, where you have this woman who is kind of, and again, they're kind of also joining, you know, sex and death together as like these sort of connected things. But you have Catherine literally riding this man to like a climax, and then at that moment, like she grabs this ice pick from behind her and, like, you know, starts like wailing on him. And I think you could really see it as both a very literal kind of fear of like a feminist threat. Like, you know, Catherine is using this very like phallic object of this ice pick to literally take out this man, and it's sort of this idea of like, you know, we've given women too much power, we've allowed them to be these like sexually autonomous creatures who can go out and, like, you know, fuck who they want when they want, and now they're gonna get their like revenge on us. They're gonna kind of, you know, now they're gonna bring us the kind of violence and beat us down in the way that we have, you know, oppressed them for centuries. So it sort of very much feels like this male anxiety about what, you know, what will happen if we allow female sexuality to be that powerful and that free, and that it will result in our literal demise. So that's really interesting. And you also have Catherine, and again, this ties into her bisexuality as well. You have Catherine as this idea that, you know, because she is this untied down person who has all these like casual affairs and these casual lovers of both genders, that she, again, much like Glenn Close's Alex Forrest, she represents like sort of sexual disease and AIDS as this like infectious agent, and, you know, she can just go around freely, you know, taking people out. In this case killing them, but that killing represents the sort of sexual freedom that she has, and that's why they've tied, you know, this freedom to, well, they've tied the sex to the death with her and this kind of, you know, liberated state that she has. So we do see other homosexual elements to Basic Instinct, which is interesting. Beth, the psychologist who was sleeping with Nick, Nick kind of finds out that Beth had basically been at Berkeley with Catherine. They'd gone to the same college. And back at that point in time, Beth went by Beth. She went by Lisa Hoberman, and her and Catherine had slept together. And according to Catherine, Beth became like obsessed with her. And just, you know, she dyed her hair and she like changed her clothes and like just started emulating her and stalking her and behaving obsessively. And you know, Dan is like, Dan, I keep wanting to call him Dan because of Fatal Attraction. Nick is like, why didn't you tell me any of this? You know, because he's investigating Catherine. He's like, Beth, why haven't you told me this? And Beth is just, you know, she's like, I was really embarrassed, like, you know, I'm not gay, I just slept with this woman once and we were like experimenting, and, you know, she didn't want all the guys at the police precinct to find out about it, basically, which I think is a reasonable excuse. But yeah, so they ultimately, at the very end of this film, they set it up that Beth is the killer, except we know that it's not Beth. Dan's, I keep calling him Dan, Nick's colleague Gus has decided to go investigate Catherine's old roommate. So he goes to this building and Nick realizes kind of too late, like, oh, something's up. I think that the killer is, you know, has decided to lure him there. So he chases him into the building and he finds him dead too late, which is really sad, by the way, because Nick's colleague Gus is just like a really great character in this film. He always calls Nick Hoss, which I just find really like fun. But yeah, so he finds him dead and like, who should rock up but Beth? And Nick obviously doesn't trust Beth at all at this point, and he pulls a gun and, you know, she's like, what are you doing, what are you doing? And she reaches for her pocket and he thinks she's reaching for a gun, so he shoots her. And he realizes too late, as she's lying there, like, you know, dying, that she was just reaching for her keys, because she still had a key to Nick's apartment, which, by the way, has a Bart Simpson keychain on it, which I love, because this film came out in like 1992, so I don't think The Simpsons was even like running for more than like, I don't know, like 2-3 years. So like for her to already be like this, like, I've got a Simpsons keychain is just like really amazing. But yeah, he realizes too late that it wasn't Beth. But interestingly, he goes back and he never really confronts Catherine about this, like, even though, so like they decide at the end of the film that all the police decide to wrap it up. They're like, it must have been Beth. They search Beth's apartment and they find a gun and they find like loads of old newspaper clippings that like indicate that she was obsessed with Catherine. Which, yeah, I don't know, I think you could really read it in a number of ways, but in my opinion, like, Catherine just planted all that stuff in her apartment or something. Like, it just feels too easy an answer, unless we're meant to assume that Beth was obsessed with Catherine but she didn't do the killings. But anyway, the film ends and Nick and Catherine are sleeping together again, and she has the opportunity to kill him too and decides against it, and the final shot of the film, it kind of pans to like under her bed where you see that she had this ice pick hidden, like ready to go, which I just really love. They even have this great line where that he kind of quotes, Nick quotes from Gus, where he's like, well, we'll fuck like minks, raise rugrats and live happily ever after, which again, you know, just like the other films, it's sort of like, even though him and Catherine are meant to be like these wild cards who can't settle down, like they're still ultimately then going to surrender to this kind of domesticity, although it isn't like a full domesticity, because Catherine tells him like, oh, I don't want, you know, she basically tells him she doesn't want children. He's like, okay, we'll forget the rugrats part. But yeah, they decide to sort of just stay together at the end, which I think is really a really fascinating conclusion. And I really feel like the film kind of implies, I think one of the reasons why, even though it's still incredibly toxic and problematic in its treatment of women, I think one of the things I find quite interesting about it is that they kind of imply that Nick and Catherine are like true equals in their like behaviour and their outlook on life. And Catherine even says, you know, like, everyone who gets close to me, like, you know, dies, I lose them. And Nick is just kind of like, yeah, I'm the same, or he says something to that effect. And you just feel like they're on this sort of equal footing, which is very interesting. Oh, before I move on, I also want to mention that apparently for Basic Instinct, Sharon Stone made $500,000 and Michael Douglas made $14 million, which I think is a crazy discrepancy. I mean, from what I understand it, Michael Douglas was a much bigger star, but I do think that for them both to be the leads in this film, that still feels like way too big of a difference. So yeah, do with that what you will. And especially I really think that Sharon Stone like absolutely carried this film. Like in fact, I think it's one of the reasons why I like it so much. Like I just think that she gives like such an incredible performance. Yeah, so if you're going to watch any of the 3 films, I would say please watch Basic Instinct just for her performance, because she kills it. Okay, so we're moving on to the last film now, which is called Disclosure, and that came out in 1994. So in Disclosure, Michael Douglas stars opposite Demi Moore. In this film, he plays a man called Tom Sanders, and Tom Sanders works at a big kind of tech corp. I think it's called Digicom, or like what the stuff they work with is called Digicom. This film is really weird because like they have this like they have like an A plot line and a B plot line, and the B plot line is like all this weird tech stuff, but then it kind of like merges more and more into becoming like the A plot line towards the end of the film, which I just don't really think it was necessary. But I know that a lot of that, like I think the mid to late 90s was really starting to get into like cyber films and like the digital world, obviously Hackers being a really famous example, and The Net, which starred Sandra Bullock. But anyway, so Michael Douglas is Tom Sanders. Again, he's like an honest family man. He's got a wife and he's got children. And he works as the head of operations at Digicom, or whatever the company's called. And at the start of the film, an old flame called Meredith Johnson shows up, and she has taken the promotion that Michael Douglas, Tom Sanders, was expecting to get. So, you know, he's not very happy about that. So the very gist of this film, which I'm going to start breaking down, is that as I say, Meredith Johnson has come in and taken the promotion that Michael Douglas was expecting to get, which effectively makes her his boss. And they then have this encounter, which he then decides to sue her for sexual harassment. And you know, it's kind of just a battle from that point onwards, basically, of who's gonna be triumphant. But yeah, the first encounter is interesting because you know, Meredith is put in this position of being his boss. She's meant to have power over him at this point, and you know, this is the literal tagline of this film is like sex is power, and you know, it's sort of a battle of the sexes, but also about sex itself and like power dynamics of that. But yeah, the first shot you see of Meredith is not even of her like full body or her face. It's literally just her legs walking up the stairs in these high heels, and Michael Douglas is kind of looking after her kind of lustily. Before he even realizes who it is, he's just like, oh, that's a nice pair of legs. And then yeah, again he comes up to the office, and again we get the same shot of just her legs. Like I mean, they are partly building a bit of suspense about the reveal of it being Demi Moore, which isn't really even a huge reveal, because like I presume that, you know, everyone going to see this film will have seen the trailers or the posters and they'll know that it's Demi Moore. But yeah, they do all this, and you know, they could have, I think the point I'm getting at here is they could have built up this suspense before they revealed her without it being so objectifying. Like, she's literally just a pair of legs in high heels before you see her face. And if that wasn't like disempowering enough, pretty much the first thing that she says when she sees Tom Sanders again, and this is in front of her own boss, by the way, who's played by, he's called Bob Garvin, and he's played by Donald Sutherland. And, you know, this is in front of her own boss, and she says to Tom, she's like, oh, you broke my heart. Like, this is literally how she introduces herself to him. So, like, she's already kind of, like, reducing her own power, kind of. Like, she's like, oh, you know, this is the guy who broke my heart. And, you know, you could see it as, you know, a setup for her getting her revenge on him. But, like, I don't know, it just feels very much like both in, like, she's been objectified and she's been objectified and she's been revealed to be this like broken-hearted woman, so like, she's already lost a lot of her power, which is sad. Anyway, so that all happens, and then I'm going to kind of cut to the encounter and try and explain it as best I can. I feel like it would be best for anyone who's interested to either watch the film or do their own reading and kind of make up their own mind on what they think. I'm just going to kind of account it in my own opinion. Or I'll try and relay it as best I can with all of the messy kind of sexual politics of it. But basically, Meredith invites Tom up to like a private meeting in her office, and she gets a bottle of wine, so it's quite relaxed, it's quite intimate. You know, they start talking, he shows her some pictures of his kids, and then she asks him to rub her shoulders while like he talks her through this problem. So, you know, he stands behind her and he rubs her shoulders. And then he goes off to make like a phone call about like, you know, the stuff they've been discussing, and she kind of comes up behind him and starts like kissing his like neck and stuff. And you know, from the get-go, Tom is like, we can't do this, and he's kind of like protesting all the way through, keeps protesting. She sort of like unzips his trousers and starts like performing oral sex on him, and like he's still saying like, no, 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 don't do it, don't do it. So like he's constantly saying no throughout. He doesn't push her off. I'm not gonna like, I don't think that makes a difference. Like, no, you know, no is no. He said no. It doesn't matter if like he feels unable to like physically rebuff her advances. Like, you know, it's still non-consensual at the end of the day. But then the scene kind of switches, and then he seems to start reciprocating. So he starts kind of like, you know, ripping her blouse, ripping her pants off, like, you know, touching her body, and he kind of lies her down onto this. I think they're on some like a weird little scaffolding table because they're like part of the room's being renovated or something. And it seems like he's gonna start like, you know, penetrating her and having sex with her. And then like at that point he kind of catches sight of himself in this like reflection of the glass and is like, oh, you know, I can't do this. And then he stops, and then Meredith is like, what are you doing? And she starts getting really aggressive. She's like, you know, get back here, finish what you started. You know, how dare you, like, you know, get like an attack of morality after you've like, you know, had your dick in my mouth. So she's really frustrated. And you know, he runs off, like puts all his clothes back on, runs off down the stairs, and she comes out and she's like still shouting at him. And then there's this cleaner who seems like she's seen things, so Meredith kind of like buttons up her blouse and kind of walks back into the office, and that's basically the encounter. So yeah, it's I don't know, it starts off very non-consensual, and then it seems to be consensual, and then like he finally puts a stop to it. So it's yeah, a bit of a mishmash, I guess. But anyway, that all happens, and then Meredith ultimately says that he harassed her, and you know, Tom decides to sue her and say, no, she's the one who harassed me. So it turns into this big legal battle, wherein, you know, he has to prove his innocence to everyone. So yeah, they go back and forth with like this sort of heated legal discussion where in you know, Demi Moore, like, she comes out and, sorry, Meredith, Meredith comes out and just lies about everything. You know, she makes out like he was the one who initiated it all. She was the one who was crying, etc., etc. They eventually, like, bizarrely, they eventually like catch her up on, well, two things really. One is that Tom finds like he manages to get this tape because like before Meredith like started everything, he'd been on the phone to someone, so like the whole encounter ends up being caught on someone's voicemail, so he manages to get hold of the voicemail. But then also they catch her out on the fact that she'd like bought this wine in advance, which I think is like a really weird, like, even if she, like, you, like, let's just say, for example, that Meredith was interested in Tom, like, she could have gone out and bought this wine, like, way in advance, like, planning to have this meeting with him, and, you know, she could have had romantic and even sexual intentions and still been, like, you know, raped or harassed or anything at the end of the day. Like, I don't think anything that she did in advance, like, means that, you know, like, that's not how it works. So, like, I feel like that's a bit of a silly one to try and catch her out on, to be honest. But yeah, he ultimately proves his innocence, which, yeah, I think like, it's difficult with this film because I appreciate what they wanted to do. Like, I appreciate, like, I think, like, even nowadays, a lot of people still can't really wrap their head around the idea that a woman could, like, sexually harass or assault a man, which, like, she very much could. So, like, the fact that they were trying to have that discussion in the 90s is good. But I think that, like, a lot of the messaging around this film is, like, so deeply misogynistic and just goes, like, really the wrong way. Like, they have a moment at the start of this film where Tom is talking to a character on this ferry that he catches, like, to and from his office, and the guy says, like, oh, you know, it used to be that you could have fun with women, nowadays it's like she just wants your job. So it's sort of like, from the very get-go, we have this idea that, you know, like, these men are kind of nostalgic for, like, the good old days where it's like, oh, women knew their place and that they were just there to be kind of objectified and to just be like the secretaries and the assistants to the men. And, you know, he's like, now a woman dares to have power, and, like, she might take my job, and that's, like, unacceptable. Which, you know, then Meredith does very much do to Tom. You know, I mean, it's not even his job, it's just a job that he expected to get also, I feel the need to point out. And it just, like, there's even a moment when Meredith's on the phone and she's like, oh, not a bad idea for a girl, is it? And, like, even Meredith herself is, like, you know, like, reiterating this notion that women aren't actually supposed to be intelligent or have power, and, like, she's like a weird outlier, or it's like, oh, I had a good idea, I'm so big and clever even though I'm, like, just a girl. So yeah, it's really frustrating. And again, we have all these shots of Meredith and other female characters where, like, it's just their legs and heels, and it's like, constantly the film wants you to remember that women are, like, just meant to be these, like, sexual commodities to men, and they're not meant to be, like, powerful and independent and have ideas of their own. And the film also has a bit of a side storyline which I find so frustrating, where Tom has, like, an assist, well, she's an assistant to him actually, of sorts, called Cindy, and Cindy is, like, a very beautiful young woman. She's obviously meant to be, you know, at least 10 years younger than Tom, and, you know, they have this really, like, good friendly relationship, and, like, they care about each other. But yeah, like, we have a scene at the start of the film where Tom kind of, like, playfully, like, swats her on the ass with, like, a folder or something. And then she gets brought into this mediation between Tom and Meredith, and I don't think she really realised that, like, she was going to be throwing him under the bus exactly. She just kind of wanted to, like, you know, say her piece or whatever. And she's like, you know, the times where you do that, or where you, like, rub my shoulders and stuff, is, like, really inappropriate. And yeah, they have a scene at the end of the film where he apologizes to her for doing that, and she accepts. But then, like, as he's leaving, she immediately, like, swats his ass with, like, a folder, you know, like, as a callback to what happened earlier. And I just find that really frustrating because it feels like it's creating this sort of, I don't know, it feels like it's meant to be like, oh, you know, what you did was just harmless and it was meant in good fun, therefore I'm gonna do it back to you to demonstrate that it was just harmless and meant in good fun. And I'm like, yeah, maybe it was, but, like, that's not the point. Like, the point is it was inappropriate. So for, like, Cindy to then do it back to Tom after she's said herself that it was inappropriate, like, it feels, like, completely, like, nonsensical, and just really annoyed me. It was sort of, it really felt like it was downplaying kind of, like, even more, like, low-key, like, sexual harassment that women and, you know, obviously men sometimes experience. And yeah, just kind of putting it under this, like, little, like, oh, it's all just playful and it's all just good fun and it doesn't mean anything. And it's like, well, yes, it does actually. It does mean something if it makes people uncomfortable and if it's inappropriate. And yeah, I just found that very frustrating. Yeah, so I'm gonna get back onto Meredith in a second, but I just wanted to explain that the film does end with Meredith ultimately being ousted from the company. They imply that, you know, she'd been doing some shady things and trying to take control, and she didn't really understand how certain things worked, which is all fine. The film, luckily, does end, and I will give it like a little modicum of credit for this before I unpack what it did. It does end with the promotion then going to a woman called Stephanie, who is about the same age as Tom and, you know, working in a similar field. So I am gonna say I appreciate that, like, after everything this film has done, at the very least, they didn't then be like, oh, we're going to put the promotion back in the hands of a man, because that's like where it belongs. So, you know, they did still be like, you know, we are going to still end this film with a woman getting that job. However, I will say that Stephanie feels like a very kind of she's been very like sexually neutered as a character. Like, she wears very modest clothing, she's like an older woman, she's got a son, so she's like a family woman. So like in every respect she's very like non-threatening, and she's like she's basically the opposite of Meredith, who's like this younger sort of sexually liberated woman who's not, you know, not married, not tied down. So for them to give the promotion to Stephanie, it feels like it still reinforces a lot of what this film is trying to say, which is that women who, you know, women who are liberated and are free and aren't part of this nuclear setup, are, you know, a threat, and they don't belong in the workplace. We don't want them to be career women. We, you know, we want to keep them in a position where we can kind of, you know, swat them on the ass, or where we can, like, you know, have these gratuitous shots of their like legs and kind of objectify them. But we don't want them to have power, and we don't want them to be, you know, working their way up the ranks. So that is really frustrating. And I think that it's difficult to feel like, even though Meredith is set up as this sort of villain, ultimately she's like this femme fatale who's like, you know, I say seduced, but it's meant to be that she's assaulted Tom essentially and just taken what she wants, and, you know, she's just out there to ruthlessly like cutthroat her way up the ladder. It doesn't really feel like that works, for a number of reasons. One is like I just say, like, they're constantly, you know, they're constantly objectifying her, and at the start, like I say, they immediately let you know that she's brokenhearted over Tom. So like in two ways she's already been kind of like, her power's already been reduced. But the other interesting thing is that I feel like a lot of this film is ultimately just kind of a male power fantasy, in the same way that the other films were, where you've kind of given a man the benefit of being able to be seduced by this powerful, beautiful woman, but then he also gets the advantage of like getting to put her back in her place. So it's like, you know, he's like, oh, poor me, this like really gorgeous woman just came up to me and like wouldn't take no for an answer. And like, even though even though it's already been like stated in canon, even though it's already been explicitly mentioned that I'm attracted to her and interested in her, you know, I'm not allowed to sleep with her because I'm married, but she's taken that worry out of my hands because she's, you know, she's done all the legwork, she's the one who seduced me. But like, poor little old me, like, I can't lose my, you know, I can't lose my status, and I can't lose my job and my wife. So, you know, we need to put her back in her place. We can't have this, like, you know, we can't have this powerful woman like taking what she wants from me but then still getting to be powerful. So then, you know, the film has to like dismantle that. It has to kind of like break down, has to find these ways to break it all down and put her back in a place. And I suppose the fact that, you know, maybe I'm being ungenerous here in like a consensual way, but I think the fact that Michael Douglas seemingly consents to at least the second half of his encounter with Demi Moore, and you know, feeding that into like the broader talk around her. Like they have a scene where, which they do also unpack in the mediation, where he and some of the other guys are kind of sort of laughing about the fact that this woman gives them all boners and stuff, and you know, it's just this constant reminder that like she's just there for their pleasure at the end of the day. Like even if none of them are going to act on it, like, you know, she's just there for them to enjoy, and they don't really like respect her or take her seriously. So I think that really, and you really see the anxieties of this. Like, interestingly, even a lot of the scenes where Michael Douglas is looking at Demi Moore from afar, like doing business with these other men, he is actually looking down on her from high. And I think that's again another, like, so many of the choices in this film are why it doesn't, the power dynamics don't add up to what like visually you're seeing. It's like, you know, he's still looking down on her, he's still, and the same with the legs, it's like he's looking at her as a body and he's looking at her from above. Like we're still constantly being fed this idea that actually he's the one with the power, or that he certainly has more power than the film wants you to feel like he does, which I think is interesting. But yeah, I think that all three of these films are really speaking to this idea that all these women have something that make them a threat. So all of the three women, like Fatal Attraction, Basic Instinct, Disclosure, they're all sexually liberated, independent women, and then they all have other elements to them that make them like more of a threat. So with Glenn Close's character, it's that she's, you know, mentally unstable. With Sharon Stone's character, it's that she's bisexual. With Demi Moore's character, it's that she's this career woman, and they all feed these things into like just the fact that these are, you know, young women who have their own sexual agency, and the films just really want to find ways to kind of disempower them for that, to punish them for that, actually, to or even to make you believe that they have more power than they do, while kind of actually demonstrating how much power they don't have. But yeah, I think that's everything from me. I'm trying to think about whether or not there are actually any modern erotic thrillers. Like, I don't think I'm aware of what they are, or like how they might be treating women differently, if they even are, at this point in time compared to these films, because yeah, I don't know really what the modern day equivalent of these, you know, I think in the 80s and 90s you can obviously see these threats of sexual agency, especially like, you know, in light of the kind of AIDS sort of anxieties and paranoias, and also these anxieties about women as career women and how that threatened the nuclear family. And yeah, I don't really know what the modern equivalent to that would be. But yeah, nonetheless, I found these films really interesting, and the way that these themes kind of ran through all three, and then the fact that Michael Douglas was in all three of them as well, just like really just beautifully tied it together. So yeah, if you do watch them, let me know what you think in the comments. Oh, also, Fatal Attraction, no, I'm gonna get this wrong. Two of them were based on books, Basic Instinct and I think maybe, yeah, Basic Instinct and Disclosure were both based on novels. I might actually try and read the Basic Instinct one just because I actually liked that film, whereas the other two I just yeah. Yes, if you're going to watch one of them, I definitely say watch Basic Instinct. But yeah, those are my opinions on all three. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sure I'll be back with more info dumps and hopefully some more videos about maybe 80s and 90s films in the future. But yeah, thank you for watching. Bye.